I'm very kindly joined today by Ramsey Ashby, who is one of our clients here at Plandek, and is famous for possibly having the world's longest job title, which is always interesting to enter into Zoom. So I won't do much more of an introduction. I'll let Ramsey introduce himself and talk a little bit about Plandek, and then we'll get kick started. So Ramsey, take it away.
Cool. Well, yeah. So my name is Ramsey. I work as a software delivery operations manager in Skyscanner. What that essentially means is, as a team, we're relatively small. There's around about 6 of us just now, and we support the entire organization, but principally engineering, with things like ways of working, goal cascades, change management, that type of thing. A little bit of delivery management, a little bit of program management, a little bit of agile coaching, a little bit of 101 other things in there as well. And that obviously makes us quite an unusual team. There's not a lot of teams and companies kind of like us, but it works quite well for Skyscanner to try and help land initiatives like what we've done with Plandek today. So if it's okay with you, Will, what I'll do is I'll share the slides that I've got, and we'll kick off.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So we're going to give a quick overview today of basically what we've been doing with Plandek and how we've landed a bit of a culture around sort of team metrics and sort of continuous improvement being data-driven. A little bit of history about Skyscanner. So we're around about 1,300 people. We've got a picture here of our Edinburgh and Glasgow office people. Roughly 700 in engineering or engineering managers, and we're split across around about 13 tribes and about 80 squads. Other than the team I'm in, so other than software delivery operations, we don't have any agile coaches or any scrum masters. So at an individual team, at individual squad level, it's really down to the engineering manager to sort of drive the continuous improvement behaviors and try and make sure the team themselves are working well. We don't have any sort of fixed way of working. We've got guidance, we've got recommendations that we like our teams to try and follow, but really it's up to the teams to try and figure out for themselves how they want to work and how they're going to be most effective. And obviously with that, there's quite a lot of trust, there's quite a lot of autonomy, and that's one of the reasons why Plandek is such a useful tool for us, and having that culture of metrics is such a valuable thing for us going forwards. So if we kind of go back to the very beginning, why did we want to look at team metrics at all? What's this all about? What's the point of this? And for me, it really comes down to this equation, and it's one that you're never going to see in a computer science course or a business degree or anything along those lines. And it's inputs plus work plus magic equals valuable working software. And if we think about the right-hand side of that equation, we're pretty good at understanding sort of quantitatively and objectively what that means. We've got business metrics, product metrics, and service metrics that give us a pretty good handle on what it means to have valuable working software. But in contrast to that, the left-hand side is something of an unknown. There's a huge amount of room for improvement there, and that's definitely something that we see as an opportunity for us as a business to get a competitive advantage. If we're better at understanding what that magic means, if we're better at understanding how we can refine the inputs and how we work together, we're going to be more effective in delivering valuable software, not just to Skyscanner themselves, but to our travelers and to our partners as well. Fundamentally, this is all about helping us optimize for those business outcomes rather than for our own personal busyness. And one of the challenges is that as humans, we often come to think that good work is all about working hard, and working hard can easily just mean being busy. But as we all know, being busy rarely means that you're actually being effective. In fact, quite the opposite tends to be true. The busier we are, the less stuff we're actually managing to get done. But how can we ever really be sure that we're doing the right thing? And truthfully, most of the time, we don't know. We kind of just guess. We guess that if we do this thing, if we make this change in our teams, if we refine the backlog in this particular way, that's going to help us, drive the right outcomes. But we don't know those things. We just kind of have these leaps of faith. And this is where, with the right metrics and the right culture, we reckon we can get some big improvements. So traveling back in time around about maybe 16 or 17 months when we first started thinking about this, right back at the beginning, where did we start? What were the metrics that we were thinking about? And right at the start, we were thinking about the DORA metrics. And there was a general acceptance in Skyscanner at this time that the DORA metrics were probably beneficial, with reasonable level of adoption with them. Not necessarily at the extent that we would like, but people were aware of them, they knew what it meant. And if we talked about things like lead time to change or deployment frequency, they were pretty well understood. The challenge with DORA metrics, though, is they really only focus on one fairly small part of the development lifecycle, and that's the part right at the end, actually writing code and getting it out into production. They're really valuable for understanding how that part of your process is working, but they tell you basically nothing about that end-to-end time. And one of the things that we're kind of very consciously aware of is that that part at the end of the cycle tends to be one of the parts that works quite well. But at the other extent, when we're coming up with ideas, when we're brainstorming, when we're trying to come up with visual designs, thinking about our system architecture, design reviews, and things like that, that's the part that we think, actually, if we can really improve that, really refine how we work there, that's where we're going to get the biggest gains. And obviously, the DORA metrics do virtually nothing to help us with that. So we began thinking as a team, what could we do to possibly help with this? And we were inspired by a book called From Project to Product by Mick Kirsten. And in the book, Mick talks about 5 different metrics. Flow time, which is essentially cycle time, and we were interested in that at both an epic and at a story level. Flow load, which is essentially work in progress, and again, we were interested in that with both epics and stories. Flow efficiency, which is essentially the percentage of time that a story spends in a block state. So for example, if you've got an engineer who's writing some code, they're sitting down at their keyboard, they're typing a load of stuff out, they're actively working on it, and then they say, cool, this is done, it's time for a peer review. So they drag the card into the next column in Jira, and they say to the team, can somebody take a look at this work I've done, please, and hopefully approve it and get it merged and get into production. And the time that it's waiting for somebody else to work on it, well, that's inactive time. That's pure waiting time. No one's actually doing something, and that will then impact flow efficiency. Obviously, if you've got third parties or dependencies as well, that's also the type of thing that could impact this. We also had flow velocity, which is basically just velocity. And then finally, flow distribution. And this is distribution of work over different types of ticket. So thinking about features versus bugs versus debt, that sort of thing. And we reckoned that if we were to focus on these metrics, that would help us understand end-to-end how long it takes us to actually deliver software and what we can do to potentially try and improve some of these things as well. We'll come back to this a little bit later on, but spoiler alert, we didn't stick with these metrics, but as a starting point, they're a really good place for us. One of the first things that we did was a little bit of a trial with a couple of squads who were particularly keen, particularly enthusiastic to try and help us validate whether or not this made sense. Essentially answering the question, could we improve how our squads work by using a data-driven approach? And if you look at this squad here, we can see that on the x-axis, we've got dates, and on the y-axis, we've got number of concurrent epics that they had in time. And the different colors represent the number of different, the colors represent epics, and the sides of the colors represents the number of tasks per epic. And we can sort of see below the aqua, the teal color dotted line there, they had around about maybe 6 or 7 epics in progress quite consistently over the past few months. And we challenged them to say, can you cut that down? Can you reduce the work in progress that you have with epics? And if you can, let's see what improvements that we can get. And we can see with the red line that, yeah, they were able to do that. They were able to cut that down to around about 2 or 3 epics. But crucially, the overall volume of work they were doing was quite consistent. The average number of tickets is about the same. We're just much more focused on those 2 or 3 epics now, rather than having the team going off in lots of different directions. And of course, reducing work in progress, like we all know the benefits it can bring, but sometimes seeing it on a graph just makes that a little bit more convincing, that little bit more compelling. And we saw all of the benefits that you would expect to see. So what we're seeing here is essentially the efficiency of the team, where the purple color shows the active time and the yellow color shows the waiting time. And obviously, if you look at the 4th bar along there from the left-hand side, we had periods where this squad was spending a huge amount of time waiting on stuff, but most of the time it was floating around about maybe sort of 70 to 80%, with the odd time when it was a little bit better. After we reduced that level of work in progress in the team, we saw roughly a 37% reduction in cycle time. And obviously that's massive. If we can get every one of our teams to get 37% more stuff done in a particular time period, the competitive advantage that gives us is absolutely massive. So at this point, we've proven the concept. We've proven that by using metrics that we can identify areas for improvement in teams. And by making those improvements, we can then see the impact in another set of metrics. So this is really good for us. And at this point, we started to think, cool, awesome, we're on a roll here. We can start to roll this out a bit more widely with a slightly wider trial group. And it was at that point that we started to feel probably one of the first proper points of tension that we had. And what we learned was that the flow metrics, good as they were just a little bit too confusing for people. And if you sort of go back to this slide and think about what we had here, just about everything on it, there's already an established term for this. So flow time, we already have cycle time. Flow loads, we already have work in progress. And people understand these things. So for us, bringing in this new vocabulary didn't help us. It just made it more confusing. So we decided, rather than sticking with that, let's pivot a little bit and try and get a slightly more simple, better understood, stronger foundation in place. And one of the nice things with Plandek as well is that obviously it doesn't tie us to a particular way of working or a particular set of metrics. We can adjust what we're doing, and that's exactly what we did. So we decided that essentially there's two key areas we want to focus on: the delivery side of things and the engineering side of things. And on the delivery side, we've talked about things like cycle time, work in progress, efficiency, velocity, sort of distribution over different work types. And on the engineering side, we're thinking more about things like PR cycle time, deployment frequency, mean time to resolve, code knowledge, those types of things. So we built two template dashboards that we started then rolling out across the organization with the idea that all of these metrics combined will contribute towards epic cycle time. And today, sort of fast forwarding 12 months, epic cycle time is basically our North Star amongst the sort of the prod eng group in Skyscanner. And the reason we've indexed so heavily on epic cycle time is that it's basically our vessel for value delivery. And what I mean by that is, whilst our engineers, whilst our product teams will be delivering work, pretty much every day, at least multiple times a week, they'll be shipping things out to production. At a task level, at a story level, the amount of value that they're shipping is actually pretty slim. And it's usually only once we take multiple tasks, multiple stories combined, bundle them all up into like a feature that actually gets turned on, that we start to see value being realized. And it's generally at an epic level that value exists. So in terms of thinking, what are we optimizing for? We don't want to optimize for lines of code written or number of PRs that are merged or anything like that. We want to optimize for how often we can deliver something that our travelers, that our partners actually care about. So for us, fundamentally, that's about epics. If we sort of travel back in time, sort of roughly 10, 15 years when waterfall was still quite ubiquitous across the software industry, we got quite a lot of insight as a byproduct to how we worked. And if I think back to when I joined Skyscanner almost 10 years ago, we had a waterfall release process that lasted roughly every 6 weeks. So every 6 weeks, we'd have a new thing shipping out to production. And within that, we'd have really distinct phases. So we'd have a phase when we were developing. We'd have a phase when we were testing. We'd have a phase when we were rolling it out to our staging environment. Then we'd have a phase when we'd roll it out across all of our data centers. And we had really strict sort of timekeeping around that. We had really good visibility of how long it actually took us to do one of these releases, because obviously it was never perfectly every 6 weeks. Sometimes it'd be 5.5 weeks, sometimes it'd be 7 because something would go wrong. Alongside that, we had a really big release note. And at the top, we'd have all the really big, exciting features. We'd have everything in between, and at the bottom, we'd have some bug fixes. If we think about that today, I don't think any company that's kind of doing CI/CD really has fantastic visibility of what they're actually shipping. They know every Jira ticket that goes out, but to actually say, how long did it take us to build and release this new feature? It lives in a bit of a sort of a dark area. It lives in the shadows because we don't really track how long it actually takes us to do that stuff. And yet, despite that, just about every team is doing regular retrospectives. They're continuously trying to improve. We invest in new tools, new technologies, new frameworks. And we often say things like, we've got to go slower today. We've got to invest effort in order to go faster in the future. But the challenge is that we don't really have a speedometer. We don't know how fast we're traveling at all. So when we say we're going to slow down, we don't know how much we're slowing down by. And when 6 months or a year later, once that investment should be paying off, we don't really know if it is. But by focusing on epic cycle time, we've got a metric that we can look at and say, okay, so we've gone slower. We can see epic cycle times increased a little bit whilst we're investing in this new framework or this new technology. But actually, we can now start to see, 2 or 3 months down the line, we are going faster as a result of it. So if we invest a bit of effort paying off some tech debt, if we spend a few sprints writing some more end-to-end tests, for example, yes, your epic cycle time is going to go a bit slower from a feature perspective at that point, but you would then expect that we can then move more quickly with less risk, with fewer bugs down the line. So epic cycle times kind of naturally become our North Star, even though we never set out to do that as such. It's become that through the better understanding of how we work and ultimately what matters as a business. And I don't think we ever could have got there without that sort of foundational work of understanding the metrics behind the team delivery. That being said, one of the key challenges that we had throughout all of this was, how do we make sure that we're not just rolling out a tool? And this is something, it's a mistake that I think probably every business has made. It's definitely one that we've made with Skyscanner in the past as well, where if we roll out a tool, people will look at the tool, they'll maybe try and improve some metrics, but they're not really that invested in it. They might even try and cheat or like game the system a little bit. We've probably all seen teams that, they see metrics as being a target, and they'll do whatever they need to do to try and get that number to be lower or higher, depending on what it is. And obviously that's not what we want. We don't get any benefit from that. So when we began, we were very conscious. We don't want to roll out a tool, but we were thinking, let's try and roll out some behaviors. Let's try and get our squad leads or engineering managers to be able to ask the right questions to their teams in retrospectives or in planning sessions to try and get them thinking more about how can we move faster? How can we keep quality high, but keep the cycle time as low as we can? And that was our initial plan. And we thought, we'll do this, we'll do a little bit of support. And then within a quarter, maybe 2 quarters, we'll have, basically the entire engineering org thinking about metrics and doing the right thing. What we found very quickly, though, or what we came to realize very quickly, was that behaviors weren't good enough. We had to go a layer deeper still and get really fundamentally into our culture. And in Skyscanner, we've got a pretty good culture overall, and we do have a good metrics culture in some places. We're very good at looking at our service metrics and understanding things like uptime and availability. And when we make a product change, we're very good at looking at the metrics that tell us, was that the right thing to do? We've got an experimentation culture, we'll do A/B tests, we'll understand the trade-offs. But there's virtually nothing at a team level in terms of how are we working? Are we doing the right thing as a team? And there's virtually nothing in that space around metrics already. And what we came to realize is if we can get that same culture that we have around these other areas baked in with our team metrics, it's going to be so much more self-sustaining because it's no longer just the engineering manager or the tribe lead who's caring about this stuff. It's the entire team. And if we can get an average engineer to think about the way that they split up work, the same way that they think about getting a peer review for their change, which they would do that without any hesitation, it's just what we do. If we can apply that same logic to how we thin slice the ticket, how we deliver things, how we design our architectures, that's when we're going to get the biggest gains. With that, though, naturally, we stopped this from being a sort of 2 to 3 quarter type rollout into something that's probably going to take a couple of years to really get there. But ultimately, we recognize that if we make the effort to get it right, we're going to get a much better impact down the line with it. That then meant we had to fundamentally change how we would actually roll this out across the org. So in a highly simplified way, this is typically how we would roll out a change. We'd start out with some education, so maybe some sort of introduction at a town hall, then some training sessions. We then move on to proactive support, which could be sort of one-to-one type things, could be reaching out to people to ask them how they're getting on. And then ultimately, once it starts to land a bit better, we'll go into more of a reactive mode, answering questions, doing drop-in sessions, pairing with someone if they've got a particular challenge. One of the issues that we have with this type of approach is that it's a one and done type thing. You do this once and that's it. It's like hitting a tennis ball. If you hit it right, hopefully it lands where you want it to land. But the challenge with anything as complex as this is it's a bit more like trying to hit a tennis ball during a hurricane. There's so many outside factors that you can't really predict that hitting that ball and getting it to land where you want it to is almost impossible. And what you can find is it only takes a small number of vocal detractors who can be very loud in comparison to the silent majority, and then your entire change initiative doesn't really land. It's also not terribly self-sustaining because you just got that one chance to really land it. And if people join the business after that, they're not involved in the same sort of training, it can be very difficult to actually make it happen. So what we did instead was we focused very heavily on trying to make sure that we were getting this cultural change at a small level. And essentially, we thin sliced it. Rather than trying to roll it out at once across the entire org, we created these cohorts. And each cohort would be treated kind of individually. They would happen in parallel, but we'd focus on each one individually. And within that, we'd do a sort of constant cycle of education, reactive support, and proactive support. In the cohorts themselves as well, we were really strategic about how we actually wanted to get these groups of people together. We had 0 or 2 people per tribe to basically avoid any sentiment that this might be like Big Brother watching them. This was never going to be metrics to try and spy on teams and cash people out or measure their performance. It was always about helping teams to help themselves. And one of the best ways we could emphasize that was by breaking free of the traditional sort of reporting hierarchy we would have. So rather than having the entire squad's worth of managers together, we'll split it up. We'll have either nobody or 2 people. Similarly, think about office locations. We went for 0 or at least 2. That way, hopefully, people kind of know each other as well. So they're getting together in these groups. People that know it might even be friends with them. It makes it a little bit of a safer place. Something we always try and avoid in Skyscanner is having like one person, like we might call them like an island, and so one person from an office on a call like that, because that just makes it quite awkward for them. If you're the one person based in London when everyone else is based in Barcelona, you're a little bit of an outsider. We also wanted to make sure we had at least one supporter or sort of keen ally, because they'll help us produce momentum. They'll challenge the group to do better, they'll do good things themselves, they'll share that with the group, and hopefully help propel us forwards. In similar spirit, we wanted to try and make sure we didn't have any more than one sort of detractor or sort of vocal detractor with it. We wanted to split them up to make sure that we weren't going to have somebody being overly negative and basically derailing the group, because a couple of people kind of get together with that sentiment. Similarly, we wanted to make sure we kept the groups relatively small so that it stayed safe. So we said maximum 7 people per cohort. Makes it small, keeps it manageable, keeps it friendly, but at the same time, it's large enough that people can, ask each other questions, get to know what other people are working on. So in all, we ended up with around about 12 cohorts, and we got this group together roughly every 3 to 5 weeks. We do a little bit of classroom style training, but we'd also spend a lot of time getting their feedback, answering their questions, getting them to share with each other what they were doing, and kind of building that peer support network. Did it work perfectly all the time? Naturally, of course, there were some cohorts that didn't progress quite as well as others, but in some, it did work incredibly well. And we've got some people who are so strong with this stuff just now that as we're going into this year and we're doing a slightly different approach, we've now got other people from within our engineering org who are helping us kind of pioneer this and help roll things out and really taking the lead with it. And I don't think we would ever have got that with the sort of alternative approach of rolling a change like this out. One interesting thing to note, and this is something that an engineering manager said to me when we started this off, as much as we didn't want to try and roll out a tool was obviously fundamentally, a key part of what we were trying to do. We were using Plandek to try and help drive this engagement, to help people understand what was happening. And we didn't want to make it sound like the tool we were trying to get people to use was like a shovel. We wanted them to be excited about it, because this is a tool that can fundamentally make their jobs easier, make their squads more productive. And everyone comes to work because they want to get good stuff done. No one's coming because they want to gain metrics or anything like that. They want to deliver things. They want to excite our travelers. They want to make a positive impact. And if we sold them on the fact that Plandek's a tool that will help them with that, it's like an iPhone, it's fun, it's exciting, they're much more likely to engage with it. So even though we were very much focused on the culture, we wanted to make sure that we didn't make the tool some sort of unfortunate byproduct of what we were doing. It was a key part of it, and the better the engagement we got, the easier the rest of the rollout was going to be. Feedback that we've got from squad leads has been really positive, by and large. But there's one at the bottom right there that I think is quite noteworthy, and it's something that we're feeling the pain of a little bit just now. And this idea that we're not quite ready for it yet. And the way that I feel about this is it's a bit like saying that you're not fit enough to go to the gym. If your team is struggling with performance or struggling to get things done, that's at the point when the metrics are most valuable, because that's when it gives you the insights to try and help you improve. So it's a little bit of a sort of a mentality gap that we've got to try and get people over. That we did a little bit last year, but I think we've really got to focus on more this year to make sure that everyone recognizes that, especially if you're in a slightly more challenging place, this is a good area for you to invest your time, because you'll get the ROI really, really quickly with it. So just to sort of summarize and come up with some key takeaways. Being metrics driven fundamentally begins with culture. But at the same time, cultural changes are never going to be as quick as you'd like them to be. We'd all love it if we could just click our fingers and make these things happen, but they are going to take many months, in some cases, maybe even many years. And we've got to be patient. Trust is one of these things, you gain it in inches, but you lose it in miles. And if you try and move too quickly and you spook people, you make them think that you are going to measure them, performance on this, you can very easily lose a lot of the good ground that you've made. As I say as well, leaders and managers, they want their teams to work well. No one's coming in to gain metrics, but sometimes you do have to help them join some dots and really understand why we're doing stuff. Bottom-up change, something we definitely nailed with this. I think one of the gaps, one of the lessons, one of the things I would do differently is I don't think we did enough with some of our senior leaders to bring them on the same journey. Naturally, we didn't have to sort of take them on the full length of the journey as we would with some of our squad leads, but I think there are some gaps today that we're having to manage and mitigate in a way that if we'd done a bit more with them from the beginning, we wouldn't necessarily have some of that pain. But overall, for us, it's been a fun journey. It's been relatively interesting, and also we have a huge amount of support from Will and from the Plandek team as well to help us try and learn from the mistakes that other people have made and to try and keep us on the right track. But I think we're a good way along the journey. We're still got a way to go, but it feels like we're getting that foundation in place now. And I think over the next sort of year, as we talk more about epic cycle time across the entire org and with some of that sort of top-down emphasis, I'm pretty confident we're going to see some really significant improvements in some of these metrics.
Lovely. Oh, thank you so much, Ramsey. That was incredible. We've got a few questions here in the Q&A box, which I'll run through. One from Aaron. I'll read it directly, and I think it kind of expands a little bit out from even just epics itself. But what tools and practices need to be standardized in order to use Plandek this way? For example, you mentioned Epic Whip, and that implies that everyone is using epics in the same way. So I probably have a little bit to add in here from the Plandek side, but to make it not about the tool, what's your perspective on it?
Yeah, I think I'll maybe take this one and Aaron's second one kind of combined because they overlap a little bit. Yeah, so definitely, I think one of the nice things with Plandek is it doesn't force us to do things in a particular prescriptive way, the way that some tools necessarily do. But obviously within a team themselves, if they're not using things in a reasonably consistent way, it's difficult for them to get, solid data from it. It's like any tool, it can only give you data it can only visualize things as good as the data you've got going into it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've been working on with teams over the past year is to try and get them to think about epics as that sort of start to finish type thing. So from the point that we start the work to the point that it's live in production and, the initial bugs are all fixed, that's what we want an epic to be. In the past, we've had a lot of epics, and even today, we still have a lot of epics that are used for things like ongoing support work. And they're basically just big buckets where everything gets thrown in. And we're encouraging teams to come up with better ways to manage things like that. We can filter them out of the data, but to some extent, that's kind of putting the blindfold on and ignoring the noise that you've got there. So it's definitely something we're still working on. We don't need everyone to use epics exactly the same, but that sort of end-to-end measure is something we are very much aiming for still. Different parts of the org, as you'd expect, it's easier for some teams than others to kind of make some of these changes as well, but we are generally moving in the right direction with it.
Good. I think, Aaron, the only thing I'd add on to that, I think, epics in the Skyscanner world make a lot of sense as a distinct unit of identifying value realization, right? So this thing contains a set of value, it's realized when it's delivered, and therefore it's the appropriate context. But from a tooling perspective, simply speaking, Plandek allows you to look across a number of different contexts, whether it's planned and unplanned work, strategic versus non-strategic, different categories of information that you can look at. The real question is actually when we look at how we're focused our attention and how that's distributed across some context, whether that context is a number of epics or some other category of information, being able to have a tool like that. And, of course, I say this promoting Plandek, but Plandek does allow you to look across a number of contexts. The helpful thing for Skyscanner, I think, is they've just used Epic as really a point of focus for how we as an organization deliver value to our travelers and to our partners. Ram, feel free to contradict me if that's unfair.
That's good.
The second point, which is slightly in line with this, and I'm gonna elaborate this slightly because I think there's something embedded in this question, which actually I was interested in as well, or I think other people will be interested in, which is, how well defined are your epics in terms of scope? And I think within that, there's actually a question of, how do you recognize value realization? Are the epics scoped out and defined in a way in which when it's delivered 100%, that is the moment there's value created? Or do you find that within your epics, you have different levels of value being created? How do you approach the scoping of epics around that conversation?
Cool. Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. And there's definitely not consistency around it as such, but what we're aiming for as a sort of vague definition is something that we would get excited about. So something that we would, shout about a company town hall and say, we've shipped this thing and it's awesome because X, Y, and Z. And if we're able to kind of shout about it and be, excited, whether that's within the team or a bit more broadly, that's probably a pretty solid sign that that's the type of value that we're talking about. It doesn't need to be 100% finished. From a sort of code quality perspective, yes, we don't want to be sort of cutting corners, moving fast, and then spending, the next 6 months trying to tidy up our mess. But does from a feature perspective, it have to be 100% complete? Probably not in a lot of cases. Obviously, depends what it is, but it should be at a point that if we were to stop working, we'd be happy with it. I think if we're having to do sort of 2 and 3 follow-up epics to get the product into a place where we're happy from a sort of feature quality perspective, that's probably a pretty good sign that we've cut it a little bit too thin.
Okay, brilliant. Next one I'll ask, Tanya asked this, and it's to be fair, it's probably another webinar in of itself. But given where we are, when we talk about the sort of influence, the changes you need to influence the ways of working, both from a tooling and from an interaction with tooling perspective. What changes to the ways of working did you have to implement to, say measure, use these metrics correctly, but really get to the point in time where, what did you need to change about how people use the tools so you got to a point where you could actually derive value from the tool? Did you have to wait? Was there a way in which you could use the tool up front to actually start deriving value straight away from hygiene perspective, or yeah?
Yeah, so out of the box, one of the nice things with Plandek compared to sort of some competitors is that it does kind of let you work with kind of the data you've got. It doesn't force you to do a certain thing, which means that from the beginning, our teams were able to get some value from the data that's there. Naturally, they will get more value if they start to tweak some of their ways of working. So some of the things, that I think we've encouraged some of our teams to do, and crucially, we've not forced anyone to do anything. We've taken them on the journey so that they know themselves that if we add some extra columns to our DORA boards, we'll get slightly better visibility of, where the bottlenecks are, where the delays are. And we can let the teams for themselves figure out what some of that stuff is. We've aggregated some of the good practice to try and, help people learn that. But we've very much steered clear of saying this is what you must do. But adding columns to DORA boards is one of the most common ones. We've got some teams that kind of have the to do in progress done, and that doesn't tell you a huge amount of stuff. If you're trying to understand where your delays are, well, they're somewhere in progress. Great, that's not super helpful. But if you've got a column that says something like waiting for peer review, something like that, and the ticket goes there whilst you're waiting, then obviously you've then got a little bit more visibility. You can understand things a bit better as well. For the most part, though, the ways that we work gave us a lot of the insights we were looking for. Like, we kind of knew speculatively before that time for a PR to be reviewed was one of the bottlenecks that we had. And integrating with GitHub, that's just a metric that we just get. Like, we don't have to do anything special to actually make that happen. Naturally, again, there's some things that we could do to try and get that data to be a bit richer for us, but as a first pass, it's enough to get our teams talking and thinking about it. And I think when you can give a team a sort of template dashboard that's 90% complete out the box, it's much easier for them to get engaged with it and to keep working and try and make it better themselves, rather than if you say you've got to spend your next 3 sprints making lots of changes to get some value out of this tool. So yeah, very few things that we had to change, but many things that we're trying to change and have changed to try and make the data a bit richer.
There's a couple more. Do you have a couple minutes?
I've got a couple minutes. Yeah, let's go for it.
Cheers. Because good questions here. Although to be fair, they keep coming in, so might be here for a while. The two somewhat similar questions, and one you touched on a little bit ago about this idea of standardizing JIRA boards and workflows, right? Trying to find a balance between complete autonomy at the team level, but at the same time providing some enforcement and structure that you can start to get and derive value from data across the board. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on where does Skyscanner sit sort of intellectually or even beyond that, just in terms of actual implementation around fixing and standardizing workflows versus providing autonomy and the cost benefit exchange there. Another one that Justin asks is on your squad feedback, one of the comments talked about helping teams move away from custom JIRA workflows. Can you share how your effort here with Plandek helped create some normalized practices over time across many squads and teams, tribes, etc.? So I think there's a at the core of both of these questions, right, is the old challenge of providing teams with complete autonomy, but at the same time, to what extent do we rein back in so that teams and organizations have the ability to get value throughout the delivery process and the way that it's articulated by the workflows and the way that you set up JIRA. Git, as you said before, is less of a problem because it's very structured. There's not much of a change you can make there, but JIRA is obviously the Wild West, as with Azure to a certain extent as well. Yep.
So as a sort of guiding principle, we're doing all of this to try and help teams to help themselves. So we're largely staying away from saying this is how you must standardize things, but we do recognize that there are some sort of general good and even best practices out there that we should encourage teams to try and do more of. So more columns on the board is a fairly simple one. Try and move away from just that generic in progress, for example. We've largely kind of left this up to teams. We've guided them, in those cohort sessions, we would talk about some of the things that we would do or that they could do. We've talked about if we were to redesign our JIRA workflow, to better suit your team, what might that look like? What are the columns you'd have on your board? How would you change things? And basically trying to just help people who aren't necessarily thinking so much about this stuff, take that step back and say, well, what actually should we do? As a company, we started using JIRA in probably around about 2013, 2014. And I don't think our default workflow has changed since then. So as a company, even though we've grown, even though we've got different projects and different ways of working, and fundamentally we're structured in a different way. We've got the same basic workflow we've had for, sort of 8 or 9 years. And I think it's just it's helped force us to have some of those conversations that we've not necessarily had to have before. There's also a kind of acknowledgement that whilst we're never ever going to be comparing one team's epic cycle thing to another, because it doesn't make sense to do so. Every team's different. They're working on different projects with different engineers. It's like comparing velocity between teams. It just doesn't make sense. But we do recognize that if we can have sort of consistent language, consistent dashboards, that will make it easier. So there's a degree of kind of self-recognition in engineering managers that if we do follow a kind of standardized approach, that will make our lives easier, overall. I don't think we would ever stop somebody, like if somebody did want to do something, radically different. I think as long as they can explain why that makes sense, we're generally speaking okay with that sort of thing. But exceptions like that are very rare for us. I think we probably will over time converge towards a more standardized thing, and we probably will get to a point where we'll just say, let's do this. This makes sense. As an organization, we've kind of independently solved a few problems. Here's the common threads. Let's go with that now.
Yeah. And I think the only thing I would add on to that in this conversation, because I talked to a lot of clients that ask these questions, and I think the sensible gauge here is, in that cohort environment, I think it's the perfect environment to have this conversation. I think there's rationale. There's no perfect workflow, but there is a indication of, thought in terms of why things should be one way or another. And I think as long as the team has a, close understanding and a good argument behind why they want workflow to be this way, in a way that doesn't compromise their ability to understand how they're working, I think that is somewhere the right answer. There are some teams inevitably that will just want to do done and in progress, right? To do in progress and done. And the rationale isn't any more than, I don't actually really like Jira, and therefore the less time I can spend, the better. But that doesn't really provide them with a lot of value from a self-reflection perspective. And as you were saying before, if we are going to improve, where do we improve? If you have no data, it makes that conversation very hard to have further down the road. The last question I'll ask is one from Abby. Do you have any tips on, how to change culture? And I think maybe, again, this is probably a whole nother 30-minute, maybe even hour-long webinar. But, one of the things that a lot of clients ask us is, when we look at our, when we look at our teams, we've got a certain population that are going to be the natural sort of early adopters, very comfortable with data, really get stuck into a tool like Plandek straight away. We've got a large proportion, maybe 50% of our organization, 60%, who are maybe just very busy and therefore not necessarily kind of clear on how quickly to adopt or how to get value out of Plandek. And then you have another population which could be quite resistant to things like data for whatever reason. They've come from historical backgrounds where maybe data was weaponized or handled in unhelpful ways that you've mentioned before. I guess when you think back to your experience in working with a lot of the teams, and you've got technically very diverse environment, culturally and geographically incredibly diverse at Skyscanner, being local team. How have you, what are maybe some suggestions around, how do you bring people on that journey? People are quite skeptical or cynical about the data, what it means. How do you win hearts and minds? How do you go about actually enforcing some of that cultural change to bring a positive outlook on how do people use data to empower themselves and to improve the way that they work?
Yes, it's a really interesting one. There's definitely no one size fits all answer to it. I think one of the things that's helped us a lot, especially in those early stages, was to let people go at the pace that was right for them. We didn't have a super ambitious, super sort of structured, powerful rollout plan with it. We were very happy to let the cohorts move at different speeds, recognizing that some of them naturally will be a bit more skeptical, and one person's skepticism probably rubs off on another person's as well. So recognizing that it's okay for people to take a little bit of time to be comfortable with it. By kind of explaining, it's a bit of a cliche, but by explaining the why and really emphasizing to people, this is why it makes sense to do this, you can get rid of a lot of the skepticism and the cynicism, because people recognize and they go, yeah, it makes sense. Like, we should know how long it takes us to deliver things. It doesn't make sense for us to do retros every week and have no idea if it's actually helping us get better at building awesome software. And when you kind of take people on that journey, they kind of realize for themselves that, yeah, this is a good thing. Naturally, not everyone. I've probably lost track of the number of times that we've said at town halls or in other sessions that we will never use it to compare teams. And I think we could probably, every leader in engineering could probably get that tattooed on their forehead, and people would still be skeptical of the fact that at some point in the future it's going to happen. But it's just as an organization, it's not the sort of thing we've ever done before. So we can really just kind of lean on our past and say, look, this isn't what we do. It's not how we work. It's not how we think. It's not in our culture or in our values to do that. And to some extent, I think that's a drum we do have to just keep banging and emphasizing that we're not going to do this. But the rest of it, I think, let people go at their pace, guide them, support them, let them ask questions. And, there's nothing crazy about using data for this sort of things. You don't you have to manipulate or influence people a huge amount with it. You just kind of got to let them see that it's a sensible thing to do. And once they see that, maybe not as quickly as you'd like, but they will move in the right direction.
Right. I'll probably bring it to an end there. I'm conscious that there are a number of folks that have asked questions, but I'm also conscious of Ramsey's time, and we've overrun by 10 minutes. So I don't want to just keep asking because more questions keep showing up, which is great. Incredible engagement. But so I do apologize. But if anybody has emerging questions and you'd like to follow up on them, do contact me. Let me know. We can find a way to facilitate the conversation offline. There's no problem. I'm sure Ramsey would very kindly contribute as and where is appropriate. But I want to say thank you first and foremost to Ramsey for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's spent a bit of time with us. I know you all have busy diaries, so I appreciate you spending the time. Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, do feel free to follow up. And I think that's it. I have a wonderful Thursday evening, afternoon, morning, no matter where you are in the world at the moment. And yeah, thank you very much, Ramsey.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.